Welcome everyone to the Great Lakes Permaculture Design Collaborative.
We are a trio of permaculturists.
Rhonda Baird from Bloomington, Indiana.
William Faith from Chicago, Illinois.
Milton Dixon from Ann Arbor, Michigan.
We're teaming up to create a hands-on learning experience
that can catapult you into a regenerative practice of your own.
glpdc.info.
We'll send you to the host of our next Permaculture Design Certificate course.
Okay, so this is William Faith. I'm here with my colleagues Milton Dixon.
Hello.
And Rhonda Baird.
Hello.
And today we're going to discuss access to land and settlement patterns. And starting as we do with our permaculture flower, it's, I think, fair to say that all of these are fundamental to access to land in its way. The way that this complex issue plays out is far-reaching in its implications, and each petal of the flower is definitely represented in some form or fashion. Moving on to our first slide, we want to talk about trusts and ways that land is owned. And what a trust essentially is, it's a legal method to preserve the character of a piece of land and to prevent it from being developed or sold for speculative gain. So what that translates into is, in the cases of things like farmland or a piece of land that you're trying to preserve, like a nature preserve, you would be taking that off the market, making sure that it can't be sold or otherwise developed, and just trying to make sure that that place stays safe and that the habitat and the general character of the land is preserved. A community land trust is more of an urban modality, which is where a group of people will come together and purchase a parcel of land and then take it off the market. It can never be sold for speculative gain, so that the land is held in trust, and any property that is built on that land can then be sold, but it's always at significantly below market rate and preserved for low-income housing. So it's a way of making sure that real estate doesn't run away from us and turn into solely a profit motive. It's just ideally looking at the community and the people first and making sure that these spaces are held available for them. And then for our next slide, we get into another way of dealing with the difficulties of owning land on your own. And in this case, we're talking about intentional communities. And those can take different forms. On the left, we have a co-housing community, which is where land is held in common, but individual dwellings are owned by the individual. There's usually a community house where a lot of functions will take place, but the individual properties themselves are owned privately. On the right, we've shown this one before. This is Bedsed, a eco-village community in England, and this is a case where the whole place is held in common. No one owns an individual property. You just own your share of the eco-village, as it were. And it functions along similar principles, but there's definitely more of an ecological thrust to the work that's done there. And on the bottom is just a block club here in Chicago where people come together, necessarily ownership of the land, just a desire to have community and sort of wield the power that comes together with having large numbers of people focused on a single idea. And that can be beautifying the neighborhood or trying to get fair rent prices or what have you. But what it has in common is that all of these are based on people coming together around shared aims.
There's a cooperative housing community in Bloomington, and they've been rather successful. I think they have their third property that they've bought, and they buy larger old Victorian houses and use them as co-housing. And there is also an eco-village that had been started in the community but didn't have means to obtain a loan to develop the infrastructure for the eco-village. And so they're actually transitioning the eco-village into the co-housing group so that the co-housing group, which has great credit, can invest in developing the infrastructure for the eco-village. So it'll be a fourth property.
Excellent.
So these things can develop synergies.
That's very cool.
I had a go at cooperative housing. I joined a co-op in Chicago, and it turned out to be not so cooperative. In essence, we were kind of like our own landlords. It was very loose, and the thing that really got me was when we started talking about the mortgage on the building. There was no plan to save for this giant balloon payment that was coming. Mm-hmm. And it was a way just to have us be the landlords for the bank, essentially. So that didn't work out for me.
Gotcha. A little low on strategy, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, it sounded nice. When you say cooperative, it implies all sorts of things. And that may not always be the case. So definitely, it's worth a little bit of investigation.
Well, and the other thing is, you don't have to live in the cooperative to participate in some of the cooperative activities, or even, village and eco-villages. You can sort of be on the edges and investigate.
There are a lot of people that do.
Yeah. So, I'm not part of the co-housing, but the co-housing orders a bulk food order. And so I get to have connection and community with them through that common practice.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that live on the edges. A good friend of mine lived just across the pond from Occidental Arts and Ecology, and she was a little uncomfortable with the concept of intentional community, but she enjoyed what they did there, so she was a regular visitor and would attend their functions and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes they're set up very well for individuals or couples, but sometimes taking in a full family and family culture is challenging. You got to find the thing that works for you.
Sure, it also depends on the focus of the community and stuff like that.
Sure.
And when it comes to intentional community, it's worth mentioning that 90% of them fail. It's a really difficult thing to manage because you're talking about people and everything that comes with dealing with people. It is difficult, and they usually fail due to human problems. But the 10% that do succeed, there is kind of a method to that madness. There is a way around it.
Mm-hmm. I just want to point out these examples are urban examples, but access to land in the rural environment is also an issue, particularly farmland and people who want to farm. And there are some great websites and resources, and they do help connect older farmers who are getting out of farming with newer farmers who don't have access to land otherwise, and allow them to create partnerships.
Excellent.
Well, that's kind of just what I'm doing. I am founding a fledgling cooperative, managing 64 acres for an addiction treatment center. And they really have no desire to, one, manage the land, and two, make a profit from it. They just don't want to mess with that. And so it's essentially a gift. And so trying to work out how we formally steward that gift for both the center and for the people that want to grow there.
In our next slide, just a quick discussion about legal entities for holding property. There are a variety of ways of approaching it. One that I think is pretty good is an LLC, a limited liability corporation, which basically gives you protection, the protection that a corporation offers, meaning that the personal assets of board members and employees aren't vulnerable to debts and lawsuits that can be levied against the organization. The taxation is still passed through to the individual members, but it's a pretty good way to insulate yourself against those sort of problems. Whereas a 501c3 is a non-for-profit corporation, and once you donate land to a 501c3, you do not get it back out. So it is a serious consideration before going there. I've seen it work. A number of the animal sanctuaries that I've worked with are 501c3s, and their land is done through there, and they've actually had land donated to them from other 501c3s and whatnot, so there is something of community there. But it is a serious consideration when you go into owning land. As I mentioned before, Occidental Arts and Ecology, something that they did that made a lot of sense is they have a group called Sowing Circle that owns the land as a LLC. And they then lease that land to Occidental Arts and Ecology, which does the work. So the programs are all run through Occidental Arts and Ecology. Everything there is through a 501c3, and that 501c3 pays the lease for the land to Sowing Circle. So it's a way to own your land, but still protect it against anything happening to it or it being taken away from you, which with a 501c3 is a little bit more of a consideration.
Mm-hmm. There are lots of different legal structures, and I think the LLC and 501c3. There are other 501 structures, and there's combination structures. If you're really looking at something like that, it might be worth sitting down with a lawyer who knows about incorporation.
Definitely. Mm-hmm. And our next slide is looking at access to farmland and some of the struggles that people have experienced with that. On the left is a picture of the MST, which is the Landless Workers Movement, which came about in Brazil. And that had a lot to do with the fact that the land had been concentrated into too few hands. There was, I think the statistic was that 3% of the population owns 2/3 of all the arable land in the country. So when you have that kind of concentration and people are unable to earn a living from the land, at that point, it's a very tense environment. So the MST rose up, an organization of 1.5 million workers that wanted access to land, and so they started occupying large segments of land and growing food. On the right is one of the organizers for the Via Campesina, which started in Europe and Latin America, but it has spread since then, and it's another campaign defending workers' rights and access to land and food sovereignty. And so it's running across similar lines as the MST, but they're a little bit more broad, and they're pushing very heavily for agrarian reform and trying to work on multiple levels with governments and NGOs to gain access to land. And then on the bottom is just the international squatters symbol, which is still another method of occupying land, which is not asking for permission, just going in and doing it. And there are multiple examples of that, but my favorite one that I can think of is a person in England who basically set up, there was some unused land where some old railroad tracks used to be, and it was just unused. They put up plots there, started growing food, and had it for 11 years without ever having to consult or pay for it or do anything. They were just able to grow there for 11 years without any problems. So that was just another methodology for access to land.
Mm-hmm.
I think that squatters kind of gets to the idea that what really is ownership of land, and that so far we've kind of taken it as a given that that is a valid thing that people can do. I'm sure it could be argued that it's maybe more like slavery to own the land and to own animals and that sort of thing. Of course, we have to work with reality and the way that people see the world and work with their views, but I think it's definitely something that should be questioned. Why we do this in the first place? Why do we have what we have in the first place? And what are the effects, ultimately, to the people and to the environment?
It begs the question, is private property even legitimate?
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of, so in Russia, there's the dacha, where I don't know if it's nationwide or if it's just certain states or exactly movement, but every person has 2 acres that they are allotted. They usually they're out in the country a little bit, and they have little weekend cabins on them, and they're allowed to produce for themselves. And anything that they produce there and sell in the market is not taxed. So they can live in the city and have all the benefits of that, and then also go to the dacha in the summer for a period of time, grow crops, or however they want to do it. And in England, their allotment gardens are bigger. They have them for long periods of time. It's very different from a community garden like in my own community, which would be, something like a 4x8 space, and I'm supposed to grow, that's supposed to be my veggies, and I have to pay for that and register with the city and, all of that. So even those kinds of considerations in terms of access to land, we need to be thinking about as designers and permaculture practitioners. How can we change our culture? And this is very much coming out of the real estate mortgage debt mindset that we have in this country about access to land. So if there's good arable land, but it's in an area that is growing, like let's say Denver is growing very quickly right now, and that land is very easily converted from farmland to residential housing. And it's been an epidemic for a century in this country or more.
Definitely. And for our last slide on this subject, I just wanted to tag the commons as a concept. This is something that we're seeing this reemergence of, mostly in the digital realm at the moment, but things like Wikipedia and Creative Commons are really looking at spreading the common good and getting away from the concept of ownership and property and leaving these things for the community at large. And this is something that I think we need to see the spread of a lot more with respect to our attitudes toward land and land ownership and access for people who don't have it.
Well, I'll just come back to, again, Elinor Ostrom and her work. She's a Nobel Prize winner for her work on the commons, and just pointing out that when something is held in common and the community is empowered to manage it, they actually manage it in a way that makes it more resilient and is of more benefit to people going into the future. So if you're really into this stuff and you want a resource, I would check out Eleanor Ostrom, Ostrom.
Excellent.
So switching gears just a little bit, when we think about access to land and where people want to be, I want to start thinking about where people settle. And so there's just a few slides here. Where do people live? So this first upper left picture of the Nile and the Delta, basically just something to keep in mind is that the majority of people live along the coasts around the globe. We like to be near the ocean and also along rivers. So civilizations developed along rivers. Indigenous peoples were always moving from one place that had fresh water to another, right? So that's where people settle and where the densest populations are on the globe. And then also in arable areas, places where there's a high biodiversity. So marshes, estuaries, forests with lots of biodiversity. That's where people want to live and settle. And then they also, if there is access to fresh water, like to live in arid climates because diseases and parasites and pests are low. So as long as we can irrigate with fresh water, have access to fresh water, we like that. So that's one thing to think about. Where have people lived? Where do they live now? And where will they live in the future? As we go through climate change and oceans rising and wars and, all kinds of disruptions that happen, people will sort of tend to go back toward those things. So we see that on this Italian village on the right, where it's sort of classic, people on a body of water. I'm imagining it's a river to the left, forests around and above. That's sort of a classic settlement pattern. Sometimes I do this as a slideshow and show ghost towns from the prairie states or from the Southwest, where there just wasn't enough water and also not enough community. Like the land base would not support economic livelihood and people at a density that created community, and so people just end up leaving.
Right.
Like boom and bust kind of thing. So we need each other in that kind of environment.
Big time.
So one thing is think about land capacity. We're thinking about what's the land base and the capacity to hold people, to support a population. I could very easily have put an image of Phoenix up here, and we know that it's not likely to persist going into the future because the land can't support that many people without importing resources. The next 4 slides will take us through different scales of settlement and the patterns that they exhibit economically and culturally. So here we have on the left-hand side some nomads in Tibet. And the interesting thing about these kind of settlement patterns is that we have them all concurrently. So the nomadic way of life, we still go camping. We still create fires when we go camping and roast marshmallows or whatever we do. People do cycling tours or kayaking tours.
Or bands go on the road.
Or bands go on the road. So we still exhibit this behavior of migrating from place to place. And there is less and less room for people to move around nomadically. We used to do it because that's how we supported ourselves, following berries or harvest or hunting or fishing or however people supported themselves. And there are still some people who do that, and follow the abundance of the seasons and the earth. We're much more limited in what we can do with that. And also, these nomadic groups are small, often family and extended family groups, maybe a small tribal group. But it's not a very big group that is doing that migration. Alternately, we often will gather temporarily in a central location for a large festival or celebration. So you can have hundreds of people gathering at the Glastonbury Music Festival is one of the biggest ones, or the permaculture convergence that happens, the continental one or the international one, So we have periodic flows. Moving along a little more quickly, on the right, the next size up from that is a hamlet, which would be a cluster of maybe 8 to 12 households, small group of people housed in a very small spot, kind of a niche somewhere in the environment, and everybody is very much self-sufficient. Each household might cooperate a little bit, but everybody's sort of fending for themselves. And then the next step up from that is the village. So the village is the place somewhere between 200 and maybe 5,000 or 6,000 people would be a good population range to characterize it. But at 280 or 300 people, you have enough grouping of people that biologically you can reproduce without inbreeding in the population. And so that's why you see the church, because churches popping up in villages, because those sanctified marriage for reproduction, if you want to think about it in those terms. And the village is of a size, and usually in a situation where it is like a farming village or a fishing village or something like that, where it's permanent settlement that you can provide for people off of the land.
It's organized around a central theme.
A central economic theme that is reflected in the landscape, the opportunity provided by the landscape. And it's small. So ideally a village would have, like a 500 to 1,000 people. That's village scale, which is very, very small. But it's that size because you can know everybody and their stories. And it has a size that's very connecting to people. And because everybody's engaged in a common purpose, everybody is supportive of that purpose. And again, it's very much about self-reliance, but like the village scale self-reliance. So people will be doing common work. And then the next size up, what you see in this aerial view, is town, which is several villages together. And the size between town and city. So towns, we're starting to talk 10,000, 20,000 people. And what happens is it's like several small villages, but each one has specialization. So you get crafts guilds, you get manufacturing, you get market towns, where people bring their goods from villages and hamlets and other towns to trade. So this is where we also start to see capitalism and money economies dominating in civilization.
Right.
And then if we kind of step into the next size up with small cities, now we're talking maybe 50, 80, 100,000 people. These small cities are actually where you start to have cultural innovation. So I think it was London in the time of Shakespeare was 100,000 people or 80,000 people. Paris, the Italian cities of the Renaissance were smaller than that, actually. And that's where you start to get specialization of the cultural effect. So creativity is sort of the function of the city. And then here in the next slide, there's a picture of Chicago and one of London. So now we're talking 1 million people or more, the megalopolis, where there's so much connection and trade and economy happening, and there's the cultural functions, but there's also something that happens where it's a little bit like, if you look top down on some of these megalopoli, they're like computer circuits, a circuit board. Mm-hmm. And you can think of it like a place where human evolution is amplified.
And sped up.
So that's the draw, I think, to some of these larger cities is, especially like I have my teenage daughter and she's like, I want to go to the big city, big city. It's like such a classic, I'm going to grow up and go to the city kind of, kind of meme. And I think really it's because people are drawn to that edge.
Sure, cities tend to be exciting and shiny and bright and are generally more liberal than their rural counterparts. So it does tend to lend itself to a slightly more almost hedonistic fantasy view of what life can be like. But intrinsic in cities is also a lot of vulnerability, economic, ecological, social even, to some extent. So they have advantages. They do really speed up culture in a variety of ways, but there are also some very deep-seated drawbacks.
So just taking peak oil into consideration, there's some thought that some of the largest cities in the globe will need to shift focus as it's harder to get around, or its resources from the region are harder to get into the city, to shift more toward food sovereignty, or at least part of that, to think about really focusing neighborhoods into neighborhood villages where communities are centered, shifting in certain ways urban planning to facilitate ease of transportation so we can maintain the density of population and that evolutionary function, but lighten the burden on the region a little bit.
I think you really said it when you mentioned the neighborhood village concept. Changing scale and concept toward that style of design, I think, is huge.
So here we are in the last slide, one picture on the left of high urban density, but potential there for connection, exchange, community building, and then a village on the right that's in a more rural setting where water is there for lots of different purposes, not least of which is ease of movement and transportation, and still very much connected to the landscape. So just some thoughts about where people live and how they will persist in their communities going into the future. Village scale is where there are the most opportunities for us to live comfortably and to create permanent culture, because we can tie into each other's stories. And the idea is that we live in villages of our choosing, connected with other people and practicing the good governance that allows us to resonate and make sound decisions with our community. But those villages might be very closely connected to each other, like in a town or a city or a megalopolis. So here we are back at our permaculture flower, and we've been talking about access to land, various corporate structures and legal entities in our existing system that allow us to have access to land, or changes that might be made. And then also just some thoughts about where people live, where they might persist living into the future, and different scales of settlement and their various advantages or disadvantages.